Hi, it's Steve Hargadon. Ian, I forgot to ask you to turn your mic off just for a second while I do this introduction because we get a little bit of an echo there. Welcome to the first opening session of the first Learning Revolution conference. This is really fun. I'm going to take just a couple of seconds here to describe why I think this is an important event and why I'm really so delighted that Ian Jukes is here to kick us off. This is the culmination of an idea of bringing together the school, library, museum, alternative education, adult education, special ed, homeschooling worlds to talk about learning together. And this conference is the first event in that effort. And so I'm personally really excited to be here. I'm excited that we're going to have these conversations, and I think they're going to be critical conversations moving forward as we talk about learning and as these different worlds overlap increasingly. Ian, thank you for being here. You just nod instead of having you turn your mic back on and off. Thanks to ClassFlow. Go to classflow.com for support for this conference. Thanks to Blackboard Collaborate for providing the platform. And this is, like I said, our first real Learning Revolution event. So this is your chance now to indicate where you're participating from. Those of you who are in the room, look to the left of the whiteboard. You're looking for, well, it's not a whiteboard, is it? It's a blue board. We're looking for the star icon. Click on that twice and then click on the map and then put in the chat where you're participating from, if you would. Maybe the time and the temperature. India, I think you get the award there. 4 a.m. I'm glad you joined us. And while we move forward, because there are 135 slides in this presentation, we're not going to spend too much, we're not going to dawdle here. Please feel free to continue to put in the chat where you are. Ian, again, I can't imagine a better person to kick us off. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. So my background, for those of you who don't know it, is classroom teacher, taught every grade from kindergarten through to grade 12, vice principal, principal, district coordinator for gifted and talented, for technology, for curriculum, a provincial coordinator. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, provincial coordinator for distance learning and technology, taught at the university level for 7 years. I travel a lot over the course of the last 5 years. I've done almost 80 countries. Typically speak to about 300,000 to 400,000 people a year all over the planet. And over the course of the last few years, I've been writing a series of books. The first one was something called Living on the Future Edge, which was about global change. And the second one was Understanding the Digital Generation, which basically said, look, not only has the world changed, but also in addition to that, kids have changed. And I wrote a recent book called Literacy is Not Enough, in which I talk about education's focus today and why things need to change. So you'll hear that I have some fairly strong opinions about things. Here's what I think. I believe that the traditional emphasis on literacy, while it's absolutely important in its own right, is no longer enough. I believe that even if we were to educate all of our students to the standards of the traditional literacies, we're talking reading, writing, arithmetic, as we currently try to do in our schools, that our students are going to be literate by the standards of the 20th century, but they're not going to be literate by the standards of the 21st century. And in fact, what I'm suggesting to you is that if we're going to prepare our students for the world that awaits them once they leave school, we need to move our thinking, we need to move our assumptions about teaching, learning, and assessment beyond this primary fixation on the traditional 20th century literacies to a new and very different set of skills than the ones we've valued in the past. For example, I find it very unusual that we're already more than a decade into the 21st century, and we're still debating what 21st century learning looks like. I think that's a really silly question because we're already well on our way into the 21st century, so students are already learning 21st century skills, even if they were originally 20th century basic skills. So what I want to try and do is I want to try and reposition this question by asking, what are the new basics? What are the new basics that every single student needs to learn above and beyond traditional reading and writing arithmetic? What are the critical skills that students need to have in order to be successful, not just in school, but also in life beyond school? What are the skills that students need to develop today for tomorrow? Now, in my travels around the world, I've asked this question hundreds of times to students, to parents, to teachers, educational, political leaders, and the interesting thing is, no matter where I ask these questions, the answers I hear are almost exactly the same. The very first thing that people always describe is problem solving, that students need to be able to solve complex problems in real time. That's almost always the first answer we hear. The second one we hear is creativity, that students need to be able to think divergently and creatively in both digital and non-digital environments in order to be able to create novel and useful solutions. The third one is analytical thinking. They need to be able to compare, contrast, evaluate, synthesize, and apply. And it's interesting, a lot of people say without instruction or supervision. In other words, what they need to be able to do is they need to be able to use the higher end of Bloom's taxonomy. Now, the next one that comes up is collaboration. Okay, collaboration is the ability, I guess I'm jumping ahead of myself here. There it is, collaboration, there it is, there we are. Got to be able to collaborate seamlessly in both physical and virtual spaces with both real and virtual partners. The next one that comes up is that we want them to be able to communicate, to be able to communicate as effectively in multimedia formats as we were originally taught to communicate with text and speech. And finally, it's something that we characterize as ethics, action, and accountability, which includes things like personal responsibility, risk-taking, resilience, a global perspective, understanding other cultures, understanding other traditions, other customs, understanding other religions, environmental stewardship, altruistic service. And the really weird thing is that it doesn't matter who I talk to, every group says this right here. So my question is, we seem to be missing some things here. Oh dear, nothing like technology. We've lost ourselves some slides here. Where'd they go? Steve?
Yeah, tell me what you're missing out there, Steve.
Well, I'm missing all the slides. The next slide has disappeared. I should be looking at a slide that's 5 wheels, okay, and all those slides seem to have disappeared.
So we're seeing the 5-wheel slide. Go ahead and let me control for a second.
Well, I can't see anything, so it's really hard for me to do my queuing here. God, what's the wind here?
We're seeing global digital citizen, solution fluency, creativity fluency.
Now there should be a wheel with a green and an orange and a blue and a red and a purple circle inside a gray circle.
Yeah, and we are seeing those so that you are not as bizarre. Okay, so
I mean, I can just try. What slide am I on right now? Okay.
You're on the global digital citizen, which is a gray wheel with the 5 colored circles. Now,
well, I'm going to say, okay, so I'm going to basically say that we call them the 21st century fluencies. Now, the 21st century fluencies are mental processes that can be memorized, they can be learned, they can be practiced, they can be repeated, and they can be developed into what Art Costa would call unconscious habits of minds. When I look at this wheel, though, I get to be a little bit confused, because if we already understand that these skills are as important as people seem to be telling us all the time, I guess the question we need to ask is, why are they not in the curriculum? Why are we not teaching these skills to all of our students? Why are they not our most urgent priority? I'm going to go to the next slide here. Here's why. As Tom Peters writes, okay, what gets measured gets done. And conversely, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, okay? Okay, so in this age of standards and testing and accountability for all, the question we have to ask is, what's getting measured in our classrooms, in our schools, in our districts, and what isn't getting measured? And are there things that aren't getting measured that are absolutely essential for not just the academically blessed kids, but for all students if they're going to survive in the culture of the 21st century. And I guess the related question to that is, if they don't get those skills in our classrooms and in our schools, where do they develop them? They just happen by osmosis, and I'm going to go to my next slide here now. And I know, I understand. There are all the reasons why we can't do this. You know, people say to me all the time, Ian, I absolutely want to ensure that students develop these skills, but you know, I just don't have any choice. I just don't have the time. I have to make sure that students pass the mandated test. I'm responsible for them succeeding. My job depends upon it. Well, I'm going to say, look, I absolutely understand the pressure that educators are under. So much pressure and fear. I'm going to go to the next slide here, that we allow one day and one set of tests to drive all the instructional days and that are leading up to the test. And many educators, I'm going to go to the next slide here, feel absolutely shackled and overwhelmed by the curriculum and the administrative and the parental expectations. They feel they have no other choice than to prepare kids for the tests. But I believe when this happens, literally the tail is wagging the dog. If you want to know how to change educational policy, I can tell you, you succeed. Because no one can argue with your success. If you make this shift and your students succeed, it's an absolute guarantee that the policymakers are going to seek you out to find out what you're doing. But you can't get new results with old habits. And I'm going to switch to the next slide here now. And I know, I truly understand that change is hard. And I understand that success is even harder. Some people think that success is a straight line, but in fact, success is a long and a twisting process, and it's very easy to feel overwhelmed by this process, but that's completely normal. The process of change is messy, and it doesn't happen overnight. So I'm going to go to the next slide now, if I can find it here. The question is this: how do we have it all? I'm going to go to the next slide. How do we address both the short-term goals of preparing students for the exams, as well as also addressing the long-term goals of preparing them for the life that kids will have to live once they leave school? How do we address the need for students to learn both the traditional content and what we call the new basics simultaneously? Now, let's start by considering the big question. I'm going to switch to my next slide here. What are the new basics of learning, okay? What elements do we need to include if we're going to address both the short-term and the long-term goals of preparing our students for school while at the same time preparing them for life? I believe that we have to make a shift in our instructional approach to a model that parallels, and I'm going to go to the next slide here, what happens in real life. Next slide here. What we're talking about here is relevance. So the question we have to ask here is, what is relevant? Well, Richard Saul Wurman, next slide please. Richard Saul Wurman says that learning can be seen as the acquisition of information, but before it can take place, there must be interest. That interest precedes learning. Next slide here. In order to acquire and remember new knowledge, it has to stimulate your curiosity in some way. And Wurman says that learning, I'm going to go to the next slide here, is like Velcro. You see, an isolated fact is not a complete fastener. Only one side of learning is made up of facts. The other side consists of stories and ideas and personal interest. And Wurman says that content that's presented to students without personal interest or relevance is like only having one side of a piece of Velcro. Without personal interest and relevance, the content just doesn't stick. So, and I'm going to go to my next slide here in a second. So the first big question is, how do we make the content stick? How do you cultivate personal interest and relevance in different topic areas? Let me give you an example of what this looks like. Getting students interested in geography or history or environmental science or political issues, that can often be a great challenge. Why? Because students just don't see the relevancy, so it's really hard to pique their interest. It's really hard to get them engaged. But what if you were to talk about these issues within the context of the movie? And I'm going to go to the next slide here. Like, come on, here we go. Like Oh, now we're frozen. Okay.
Okay, so Ian, you've been doing a great job. We've been seeing the slides. I'm going to take us back to Avatar, but every time, so we are now looking at Avatar, and it's been working great.
Okay, so I apologize for this, okay? So I'll talk about Avatar. What if you were to talk about those issues within the context of Avatar, something that immediately grabs the student's attention? Now, let's take a moment to consider the multiple themes or issues that we would find in Avatar. Switch slides, please, okay? Culture clash, civilizations, colonialism, capitalism, war, geography, unrequited love, geology, astronomy, belief systems, technology, cloning, racism, environmentalism, eco-terrorism, science fiction, science fact, journeys of self-discovery. I mean, the point here is the list of possible themes is endless. Now, the question I want to ask is, within the context of a movie like Avatar, would any of these topics be of interest to the students? Would these topics be relevant to the students? And if they were interesting and relevant, the question we have to ask is why? Would they be interesting and relevant because the topic is in the curriculum? Of course that's not the answer. Because the teacher is interested in it? No. Because there is both interest and relevance for the students. So, to give you an example of this, I went out and did a search for the terms Avatar and K-12 and found a mere 36.5 million hits. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute. Now, here's another example. How about gaming? I'm going to switch slides here in a second here. How about the game called Angry Birds, okay? Okay, now, I don't know if I've got Angry Birds. Now, if you're from another planet and you've never heard of Angry Birds, it's a strategy video game in which the players use a slingshot to launch angry birds at pigs that are stationed on or in various structures with the intent of destroying all the pigs in the playing field. Now, if you've played the game, you know that it's a game that immediately grabs gamers' attention and can become highly addictive. Now, in the same way we do with Avatar, let's take a moment to think about the multiple themes and the wide range of content areas that this game addresses. I'm going to switch slides now, okay? Data collection, probability, graphing, velocity, projectile motion, vectors, parabolas, critical mass, mechanics, catapults, strategic planning, building design, the history of weapons, the effects of war, strategic planning, game design, feedback, shapes, Newton's law, trial and error, cause and effect, the scientific method, perseverance, goal setting, writing a handbook on game strategies for playing Angry Birds. I mean, the point here is, and I'm glad I finally have one, is the list goes on and on. Now, the same questions I asked before, within the context of this game, would any of these topics be of interest to students? Well, I hope the answer would be yes. Would the topics be relevant to students? And the question is why? Because they're topics in the curriculum? No. Because they're of interest to the teacher? No. No, it's because there is both interest and relevance for the students. So what I did was I went out and did a Google search for Angry Birds and K-12 lesson plans, and I found a mere 6.7 million hits. I'm going to go to the next slide here. Now, if you remember the television show called Law and Order, they tell us that the stories were quote-unquote ripped from the headlines. And that's exactly how we design our units. And the point here is that it's not just Avatar, it's not just Angry Birds, because there is literally a treasure trove of interesting and relevant topics out there to work with. Hundreds of popular games, movies, cartoons, books, music, sports, world events, websites, community issues. I mean, the list of possibilities is endless. Now, I was a classroom teacher for a long period of time, and I'm going to say, maybe this is arrogant to say, but anyone who knows anything about anything knows that the secret of success in the classroom has very little to do with being a good disciplinarian and everything to do, I'm going to change slides here, with creating an engaging methodology that compels the students to want to be there. It's not about getting students to learn, it's about getting them to want to learn, because without engagement, there is going to be no learning. If you can interest them, if you can excite them, if you can engage them, if you can challenge them, if you can make it relevant to their lives, then test scores will inevitably improve. I'm going to go to my next slide here, okay? And let's go, see if I got right there. Okay, so interest and relevance are absolutely essential elements of 21st century learning. The next element of the new basics is higher order thinking skills. I switched to my next slide, okay? And we all know that you can't talk about higher order thinking skills without referring to, next slide, Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy starts, next slide, with remembering. Okay? Remembering is basic memorization of facts, often without knowing what those facts mean. For example, I know the formula E equals mc squared, but just because I can memorize that formula or use it to answer a question doesn't indicate I know what it means. At the remembering level, you want students to answer a question like, okay, name 4 kinds of apples. List the health benefits of eating apples. This is just basic low-level skilled questions that involve memory recall. Now the next level, I'm going to move to the next slide, is understanding. Understanding is about comprehension of those facts. In other words, what those facts actually represent. For example, you could ask them a question like, compare the health benefits of eating apples versus eating oranges. This question requires quite a bit more than just simple regurgitation of the fact. I'm going to go to the next slide now. The next level is what we call applying, which is the ability to use newfound information to complete a task or to solve a problem by applying the knowledge, the facts, or techniques in different ways. So you would set up a challenge like, okay, construct and share a recipe for apple pie. In order to do this, it requires more than just regurgitation of facts or knowledge of the details. Now, these first 3 elements are what are called, and I'm going to switch to the next slide here, the LOTS, or the lower order thinking skills. We talk all the time about the need to develop higher order thinking skills in our students, and yet researcher Bob Marzano states that in most schools today, our focus is almost exclusively on lower order thinking skills. Marzano estimates that between 80 and 85% of the time, our focus is on remembering, understanding, and occasionally applying. So let's move on to the next slide. Now let's look at HOTS, or higher order thinking skills. You see, teaching and learning in the digital world focuses on HOTS, okay? See, in the new digital landscape, people of all ages are adjusting to a world where facts are immediately discoverable and where judgment between competing facts becomes an essential skill. So I'm going to switch to the next slide. HOTS starts with analysis, okay? Analysis involves the breaking down of information into its component parts in order to extract meaning from the facts that are being discovered. This would involve questions like, okay, identify 4 foods made with apples and analyze which ones have the highest health benefits. You know, you have to really dig down into the data in order to be able to pull the essential meaning from the data. I'm going to go to my next slide. The next link is evaluation, which involves making value judgments about the information we've encountered. You pose questions like, do you feel that serving apple pie as an after-school snack for children is healthy? Justify why or why not. Now, it's really important to note here, it's not just regurgitating facts. What you have to do is you have to value, you have to compare, you have to contrast, you have to interpolate in order to be able to turn the data into knowledge and wisdom. Now, you notice that as we move up Bloom's taxonomy from LOTS to HOTS, we move from a left brain to a far more of a right brain focus. You also notice that Bloom's taxonomy is just like the rungs of a ladder. You can't get to the higher levels without first going through the lower levels. So whatever the level is as your entry point, it's going to include everything below that. Finally, we're going to switch slides again. We're going to switch to creating, which is the absolute pinnacle of Bloom's taxonomy. Creating is about generating new ideas, creating new products, developing new processes. It's about designing, constructing, planning, producing, and inventing. So you pose questions like, can you identify an unhealthy recipe for apple pie, and can you create a healthy recipe by replacing your choice of ingredients? Justify the health benefits of using the ingredients you chose versus the original ones. Intellectual growth comes from a combination of curiosity, investigation, and experimentation. So if we want to cultivate, I'm going to go to the next slide here, higher order thinking skills, which are the foundation of the basics of the 21st century, this has to be where our focus is at least part of the time. Why? Well, today, more than ever, it's critical that higher order thinking skills be our focus because, you see, all around us are matters of local, regional, national, and international importance that require, I'm going to go to the next slide, outside the box thinking, okay? Whether we're talking about, next slide here, getting control of an out-of-control nuclear power plant at Fukushima and preventing it from suffering a core meltdown, or addressing the effects of drought, or overcoming global warming, overpopulation, and famine, or saving an endangered species, or reducing pollution in the atmosphere, or dealing with terrorism and militancy, or bringing peace to all nations. Whichever way we turn, there is an absolutely desperate need for people who, under enormous pressure, can think, and I'm going to go to the next slide here, can think outside the box so that they can innovate their way through these and other challenges. You have to understand that test scores don't go up because we give students iPads or netbooks or laptops. If you just stick a kid in front of a screen for 8 hours a day and hope that this by itself will enhance learning, it won't. You have to understand that the real issues of 21st century learning aren't about software, they're not about hardware, they're about headware. Critical thinking, problem solving, decision making. Headware is about developing the skills related to critical thinking and problem solving and analytical thinking, creativity and collaboration and global awareness. So I'm going to go to the next slide here. So what we have to do is we have to focus on HOTS. HOTS is the second component of the new basics for the 21st century. So this is where our focus has to be at least part of the time. Now, the third component of the new basics for the 21st century is, I'm going to go to the next slide here again, is real-world experiences. Learning from the context of real-world experiences brings everything together. Some of you may know a guy by the name of John Hattie, a New Zealander who works at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And he's written 3 absolutely amazing books. Visible Learning for Teachers, and his latest one, let's go to the next slide here, Visible Learning and the Science of How We Learn. These books represent the biggest ever collection of evidence-based research about what works and what doesn't work in the classroom. I'll tell you this, his books are amazing. Hattie has done more than 1,000 meta-analysis of tens of thousands of studies that involve tens of millions of students that show, we'll go to the next slide here, the effect size of using different instructional strategies. His analyses identifies categorically what really works and what doesn't work to improve learning in schools. The problem is that the data from his books are it's incredibly dense. They're not the most readable. So that got my wife Nikki and I to thinking, how do you visually demonstrate Hattie's data to identify what strategies are the most effective? And how do you incorporate the learning theories of others like Bloom and Gardner and Maslow and Rogers and Dale and Montessori and Glasser and Piaget and Vygotsky and Bruner? What Nikki did was she pulled the common threads of what works into what we have called the learning theories mashup. We're going to go to the next slide right here, okay? Let me show you exactly what I mean. Consistently, Hattie's research shows that we only retain a small amount, we're going to go to the next slide here, of what we hear from audio sources such as music or the spoken word. His same research shows us that we retain more, I'm going to go to the next slide here, of visual inputs, things like reading text or seeing images. We remember even more of information, I'm going to the next slide, that is audiovisual in nature, where vision and hearing are combined. This includes activities like watching and listening to a television program, a video, a cartoon, an animation, or a physical demonstration. Now, all of these are relatively, I'm going to go to the next slide here, passive learning activities. These activities primarily involve receiving information in a passive manner. And the thing is, with passive activities, student engagement is often difficult to evaluate because what might appear to be engagement may in fact be just entertainment or edutainment. I'm going to go to the next slide here now. Okay, there it is. This chart shows a summary of a recent MIT study of student neural system activity at different times of the day and night. Now, if you look really closely, you'll notice that the highest levels of neural activity for these students are for social interaction, sleep, labs, and study, and that there is more thinking involved in students doing chores and watching TV than there is in them sitting in a classroom passively listening to a lecture. That's why things that change dramatically when we move from passive, I'm going to go to the next slide here, to active learning, okay? Active learning includes activities that involve participating in the learning. This could include things like taking part, I'll go to the next slide right here, taking part, oops, here we go, taking part in a discussion or a debate or a presentation, because in all of these cases, it's difficult not to be engaged because the simple act of participating requires the mind to focus and to process what's being received in order to respond. But here's the killer. The research shows us, Hattie's research shows us categorically that the most productive environment for retaining information is activities, I'm going to go to the next slide right here, okay, that are multisensory in nature. Multisensory activities involve listening and speaking as well as simultaneously physically doing. These are what we call real-world experiences or simulations of real-world experiences. And Hattie's research shows that students retain far more when they are actively engaged in the learning process. Now, all of the stages of learning happen on a continuum. I'm going to move to the next slide right here. From lots or lower thinking skill on the left to HOTS or higher thinking skill on the right. And I'm going to go to the next slide right here. Bloom's taxonomy aligns perfectly with the learning mashup. I'll repeat what I said just a few minutes ago. The research tells us categorically that the best environments for learning involve a focus on higher order thinking skills and active learning in multisensory or real-world situations. Let me give an example of what I mean by a real world. Okay? Now, for example, I could talk about earthquakes, and I could talk about what creates them. I could explain plate tectonics, and I could use diagrams. I could even use a 3D model. I could describe a tsunami in terms of the attributes of horizontal and vertical displacement of water, or amplitude and penetration. In other words, how high is the wave and how far inland does it reach? Or I can talk about the real world, like what happened in Japan 3 years ago on March the 11th, 2011, when an earthquake of 8.9 triggered a massive, next slide here, a massive, and I mean massive tsunami off the east coast of Japan. And I could show what happens in the real world when the ocean rises higher than the land. You understand, it's like an overflowing bathtub that never stops. Understand this, the 20,000 people lost their lives that day. Some of them are dying at this very moment as you watch this video. And that's only part of the tragedy, because you see, more than, I'm going to go to the next slide here right now. Oh, I've got to wait.
So they haven't seen the video yet, so I'm going to play it right now. I've got to cue it up. Here we go.
Okay, this is the... Well, that was good. Are you there? Hello? 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 There. Anybody there?
Okay, we're back.
Okay, I'm so sorry that things were not synchronized here, but the point is this, that 90,000 people were left homeless by this. 3 years later, many of those people are still without homes. But you don't hear much about the ongoing tragedy in Japan because it's not in the news anymore. There's only sporadic mention of a nuclear reactor that's still trying to melt down, of radioactivity that's seeping into the oceans of the world and the atmosphere. And it's not just about something that's happening in Japan. We also don't hear about the train wreck in Quebec, or the earthquakes in Christchurch, or the cyclone in the Philippines, or the hurricane in New Jersey, or the mine disaster in Chile, or the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And so what happens is we forget. But the question is, what if we didn't forget? Maybe we could even do something about it. Maybe we could contribute in meaningful ways. Maybe we could design units in which we challenge our students to solve the problems of helping those in need somewhere in the world, while at the same time they can learn about geography, about science curriculum, about maybe even some math while growing in their awareness as global digital citizens. Now the question is, would students be able to connect these materials? would the learning be relevant and interesting to the students? Would it involve higher order thinking skills? Would it be real world? Well, here's my formula. My formula is that interest and relevance plus a focus on higher order thinking skills plus real world connections, that equals the new basics of learning. In education, cultivating interest and relevance for the students is often a struggle. But you see, when we use real world activities, relevance is obvious. So there's no need to ask the question, where in the world would I use this in the real world? You see, in the 21st century, and I'm going to go to my next slide here, in the 21st century, and in 21st century learning environments, students use higher level thinking to create real world products as solutions to relevant real world problems. You know, often we get asked, how can you find a real world connection to all the various subject areas? Obviously, social studies is quite easy, but what about math? So let's look at, I'm going to switch slides here again. Let's look at the geometry curriculum. Okay? Let's talk about Common Core. Let's talk about solving real world and mathematical problems involving area, surface area, and volume. Okay? Let's talk about applying the formula V equals LWH and V equals BH to find volumes of right rectangular prisms with fractional edge lengths in the context of solving real-world and mathematical problems. Now, traditionally, what we do is we teach volume by demonstrating what a cubic inch is. And then what we do is we draw a wireframe and then we label the sides of it, okay? Then what we do is we multiply it in order to be able to get the volume. Then what we do is we can give students different sizes of wireframes, and we can teach them how to be able to label all of the sides, then give a length, then give a width, then give a height, etc., etc., etc. Now, I could go on and on with this, and I usually do, but the point that we have to ask here is, what have the students learned for themselves? And the answer is basically nothing, except possibly a formula for volume. Okay, if they choose to think about it and then think about it being important or interesting or relevant enough for them to be able to remember. Okay, nothing except if they wait long enough, what's going to happen is the teacher is going to show them how to be able to get the answer. What if instead of taking this approach to teaching these concepts, we were to take a real world challenge? What if we, I'm going to carry it, what if we were to take a task like this, okay? Your graphic design firm has a new client. It's a local cafe that makes an amazing granola that they want to start packaging and marketing. Now, obviously, this covers a lot more of the curriculum than just volume. We could be talking about chemistry, we could be talking about the life cycle of plants. There's so many other things. But for now, let's just stick to math. Here's your task. Your client has asked you to create mock-ups of the package of a package in two different shapes of cereal boxes that each contain the same amount of cereal. The clients would also like you to come up with a name for the product and a design for the package that will profile and promote the features of the granola, as well as develop the promotional campaign for marketing the granola. Now, some questions that need to be addressed would be, first of all, what do the boxes need to look like, okay? And what are you going to put on the outside of the boxes? And what are you going to put in as the part of the, there we go, okay, as the background, okay? What are we going to be able to do here? What is the name going to be of this? Oh, and we've gone ahead of ourselves once again, okay? What is the name of this going to be? Okay, and what other information would we need to be able to put onto that product? Now, I know what you're thinking. But that's a lot of work. I haven't got time to do that for you. Now, we're way ahead of you in this subject. We have already developed literally hundreds of examples of 21st century learning lessons and units that are pulled directly from curriculum standards, not only from the United States, but from all around the world. And all of the units are designed to prepare students to become problem solvers and communicators. They construct their learning and they have relevant, authentic, real-world tasks and assessments. We need to build a curriculum around big ideas, about questions, about problems. School must represent present-day life, life as real and vital to the student as that they live in their home, in their neighborhood, or in their playground. Now, I'm sure there's some of you out there who might be interested but are skeptical that this will work with your colleagues and with your students. And yes, there's lots more to this, and this is absolutely a drive-by presentation. But I'm sure you have lots of questions, because it's very easy, and you saw this slide before, to give all of the reasons why you or your colleagues are going to be reluctant to try this. Questions like, how can I be sure that my students are going to be able to pass the test? Where do I find the time to do this? I can hardly cover the curriculum as it is right now. How do I learn how to teach this way? These are all fair questions. Now, what I want to do is I want to tell you about a very interesting research study done a couple of years ago by the Bertelsmann Group. They're a media company from Germany in Michigan. It involved two groups of 1,000 students. I'm going to go back here, okay? It involved two groups of 1,000 students who were studying the grade 8 social studies curriculum. The first group were taught the curriculum in the traditional manner that's all too familiar to us. Teacher stood at the front and delivered the lecture. The students sat in rows. The teacher talked. The student listened, maybe, okay? Worksheets, drill and practice, and traditional tests. The second group, we're going to go to the next slide here. The second group learned the very same content primarily through process and problem-based learning approaches with individual and group activities, the use of various technologies, and a blend of student and teacher assessment. At the end of the year, both groups were tested using the very same traditional Michigan State exam for social studies. So the fundamental question we have to ask is, how do you think these kids did? Well, I'll tell you this, the results were stunning because the scores were identical for both groups, regardless of whether they learned by traditional or alternative means, which a lot of you might take to mean that you're just wasting your time listening to all this new age crap, and that there's no need to change the way that teachers teach, and no reason to invest in new instructional and assessment processes or technology, that the old approach still works just as well as ever. But if you believe that, you'd absolutely be wrong, and here's why. 1 year later, the students were given the very same test, okay, and the group that were taught by the traditional means, they were only able to recall approximately 15% of the content, and they viewed the social studies materials as a series of atomized and unrelated facts. Meanwhile, the group that learned by project and process learning approaches, they were able to recall more than 70% of the content, and more importantly, they were able to demonstrate a deep understanding of the integrated nature of the learning. In other words, they not only remembered the content, but more importantly, they understood its significance or its context, which takes us right back to our learning theories mashup and our formula for cultivating the new basics for 21st century learning. And that formula is that interest and relevance plus a focus on higher order thinking skills plus real-world experiences equals the new basics of learning, or as we all learned so very long ago, tell me and I forget, show me and I remember, involve me and I understand. I'm going to repeat again, the best environments, oops, that's all coming up slow, but there it is, okay, I'll repeat again, the best environments for learning and retention involve active learning in multisensory or real-world situations. More importantly, and this is the critical piece you need to take away from this, when the content fades away, as it inevitably will, what remains behind are the new basics needed for living, working, and learning in the new digital landscape. It's this stuff right here, the skills that we've identified as being absolutely essential in the lives of our students beyond school, the stuff that we like to call the 21st century fluencies. Now, in our book called Literacy's Not Enough, we outline a step-by-step process for creating inquiry-based unit plans. Now, although the book is useful, you don't need to buy it. We have already uploaded hundreds, and I do mean hundreds and hundreds, of examples of 21st century learning units that you can download and use to your own benefit in any way that you want, okay? Or you can just use them as they are, or you can modify them as you need. But the last thing that we want this site to become is just another online source for downloadable Blackline Master learning units. We want you to be able to create units on your own. Our experience is that to truly understand the model, you have to be able to create it. And we're trying to build a global collaborative community to support you as you build this. So what I ask you to do is I ask you to go out to the website. I'm going to give you the information on this right now, okay? I'm going to ask you to go out, here we go, to this website right here. It's app.fluency21.com. And when you go out there, you'll sign in and you'll log in, and you will then be able to get access to all of the resources that are out there. Now, I've got to get out of here. I'm almost out of time. But if you would like to communicate with me, or you'd like to talk to my therapist or my attorney or my parole officer, here's where you can contact me. My email address is iajukes@me.com, and you can tweet me at ijukes. So I'm going to stop now. Steve, you're going to jump in here, and you're going to tell me exactly what it is we're going to do. This was one of the more stressful activities I've had.
I think you have modeled for us.
This has happened. This is the second time this has happened. I'll be needing to talk to your attorney, Steve.
You have modeled for us moving forward with confidence in a less than perfect circumstance. So obviously you couldn't see the slides as you were clicking through them, but they were spot on. They were perfect. So if you have a question for Ian, you can raise your virtual hand. Go ahead. Say that again, Ian.
I'm just saying, let's do it by voice if we can.
Okay. If you have a question for Ian, he prefers by voice, which means you would raise your virtual hand. It's the third icon over in the participant window. That's a hand icon, and I'll give you the microphone, and you can ask Ian a question. Ian, so while we're waiting for that first question to come in, we're going to hear in the next 2 days from people in the homeschool world, the museum world, special ed world. Some of them will say, this is still a very top-down model. Where is student self-direction as a part of this? There's a difference between self-direction and self-discovered. And the whole point in this model is that all it does is lays out possibilities, but in the end it's the students that are going to decide what their path is going to be to go through this. This is very, very much a self-discovery model rather than a self-directed model. Okay, Betty, you've raised your virtual hand. We've given you the microphone privilege. You click on the talk button to turn your microphone on. Well, Betty, that talk button is right below the image of Ian.
Got it. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Betty. Sorry for all this today. It's all Steve's fault.
This was excellent. My question is, do you have units that would be related to preschool? Because I'm working on designing some units for preschool.
The answer is no, we're working on it, but what I would really strongly suggest is you go out and look at the model, because the model is there. There's an actual curriculum writing tool that helps you identify the competencies, the core competencies that you want to introduce to kids, and then it takes you step by step through the process of being able to create this for themselves. But I want you to know this. I was a kindergarten teacher for 9 months, and I was in therapy for about 7 years afterwards after that. But the bottom line is, I think that what most kindergarten teachers do is exactly what I'm describing right here. I think that you're already doing this, and you know, I always remember looking as a school administrator and as a district administrator and looking in a kindergarten class and saying, I want to be in that class. That looks like so much fun.
Right, right.
So the model is there, and I've got an email address there, and if you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to give you some directions as to where you might go to get resources.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for putting up with me.
Thanks, Betty. Hey, if you have a question for Ian, you can raise your virtual hand. It's that third icon over the hand icon, and we'll give you a microphone. Ian, while you were talking, a question came through about is there any cost to use the resources on the website?
Absolutely none. This is paying it forward. We've been very blessed and had the opportunity to travel over the world. This is trying to pay it forward for those opportunities. This is not about trying to make money. This is about trying to develop a model that maybe will help transform the way we look at teaching and learning and assessment. No cost.
So I know that Ian was hoping that he would get questions by voice, but if you're shy and you haven't raised your hand because you're shy, do put a question in the chat and I'll ask it for you.
Who said I wanted to ask anybody to ask me any questions?
Oh, was that my misunderstanding?
You know, I am very sweaty under both arms right now. As you know, Steve, even though I've done 10,000 presentations, I'm a complete nervous wreck when it comes to doing presentations, regardless of whether I have 3 people in front of me or 30,000 people in front of me. And Mother of God, when I'm making it up as we go and I'm not seeing anything on a slide, it's a little stressful. I will be wanting to talk to my therapist about this afterwards.
I think you've earned some pay-it-forward points just for that in and of itself. So were you reading from notes? Did you at least know where your notes were?
I'm looking down here, you're talking about the notes at the bottom here, so maybe I should just scroll up to the top here and see what the comments are. How about that?
Yeah, you're getting lots of compliments on the session. Excellent presentation. Thank you.
It's really fallen. So the question, one of the questions that was asked here was, you know, is this designated to a specific state? And what we've addressed is we've addressed both Common Core, and we've also addressed the few states, particularly the Texas state standards, which don't use the Common Core. But in addition to that, what we've got is we've also got the New Zealand standards, we've got the Australian standards, we've got the provincial standards in Canada, and the beauty of it is that we're all addressing the same essential content area. So creativity is just plagiarism from multiple sources. So you can just take this stuff and utilize it in any way, shape, or form you want. I just don't want you to end up, I want you to learn first and foremost how to be able to write these for your own. And by the way, we're working on a parallel model for this, which is called JITL, which stands for Just-in-Time Teaching and Learning. And so instead of doing entire units based on this, the JITL model is about how you can take one period or even 20 minutes of a period to set people up for these kinds of experiences so that they involve real-world relevance and higher order thinking skills at the same time. So you need to watch my Twitter account for information. We're about to post this stuff.
And there was a question about whether or not there were states or schools using the 21st Century Fluency Project. And Steve Woods replied that the county office, Tulare County in California, is a lead organization, yes. And I think there were others. Does the 21st Century Fluency Project allow for user sharing, Dave wants to know.
Yes, of course. That's the whole idea. This is not about trying to make $1 gazillion. This is about paying it forward. This stuff is out there. What we're trying to do with the tool is to create essentially a Facebook for educators. And it's a Facebook of resources so that what you can do is you can develop these units independently by yourself. You can develop lessons independently by yourself, or what you can do is you can work collaboratively with people in the same school district, in the same state, in the same country, or globally. That's the whole purpose of this, is to try and, you know, I got to tell you a short story about my time as a teacher. I was teaching a grade 7 class at the time, and there was a teacher in the next room who will remain unnamed. Her name was Jean Davis. And Jean had this absolutely wonderful book on teaching Introduction to Algebra to students. And I went to Jean and I said, that is an absolutely incredible book. Can you tell me where you got it? And she said, no, because you might use it. And that whole hoarding mentality is absolutely contradictory to what we believe in. We believe in basically being Johnny Appleseed and throwing the stuff out there for everyone to use.
I can hear it now. I was giving a session online with someone who will remain unnamed, Steve Hargadon, and the slides didn't work out. Leonard wants to know, yes.
I'm getting a complex from making these presentations for you. The last time was
I owe you somehow.
Okay, so go for the question.
Okay. Leonard wants to know, he says, my concern is whether or not this remains too tied to the current paradigm through standards and tests.
Absolutely not, because if you go and look at the writing tool, you will see that, for example, we don't not only focus on quantitative summative assessment of learning, we also talk about qualitative formative assessment. We have this thing called a rubricator, which allows you to be able to assess both end product of learning, but also the process of learning. So it absolutely, categorically, is not tied just to Common Core standards. It's a model for learning, and how you introduce the concepts and how the learning is assessed is going to be entirely up to you. It's going to be based on a whole series of derivative models that you can count on.
Okay, I'm going to clap for you here, Ian. I'm hovering over the smiley face. I go down to your applause. Hopefully the combined applause pushes a little breeze your direction and eases the sweating. Thank you so much. This was really terrific. You're a great kickoff to this whole event. For those of you who are interested, the next event, there's a link on the screen. Ron Stuckey's going to talk about Minecraft and curated learning. Thanks to Ian Jukes. What a terrific way to start. Ian,
give me a B. Give me another B. Give me another B. What does that spell? That's what I feel like right now. Thank you, Steve. If I can never be of any help to you again, don't call me. I'll call you. Okay? Bye, guys.
Bye now, Ian. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, man.
Those of you who are in a session like this for the first time, you'll notice that we have to have you exit the room for the recording to process. Click on the red X at the top right, or go to File and Exit, or click Out, however you would do so on a Macintosh. Ian was terrific. I'm sure that was stressful, but he did a great job. And I'm going to put that link back up to the next session. Ron Stuckey on Minecraft. Take care, everybody. Bye now.